John Knox, a soldier-turned-hitman working for the crime boss Jericho, meets with his fellow hitman Muncie in a diner. He orders coffee before he and Muncie begin chatting about a case where a woman poisoned her husband over 8 months by putting antifreeze in his coffee every morning. The waitress comes with their meal, and John asks for coffee again, forgetting he already got his coffee. John starts to eat, but the meal doesn't seem to sit well with him. He tells Muncie he is about to catch a flight out of town to take care of personal stuff and should be returning the next day. Muncie is concerned that John is taking a job out of town, which would anger Jericho, but John reassures him it's nothing like that. After the meal, John mistakenly approaches the wrong car but plays it off like a simple mistake. It turns out John is visiting his doctor to run some tests as he has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. After the tests, the doctor reveals that John is actually diagnosed with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, an incredibly fast version of Alzheimer's. The doctor reveals that John only has a few weeks before his memory completely goes and suggests that he make arrangements as soon as possible, like a care facility. John spends most of his time with a street worker named Annie. He recalls that today is his son Miles's birthday, who hasn't spoken to him in years. It turns out Miles found out John's real profession, but he tells Annie he works for the IRS. She notes that that's the first time he has told her about himself, and John offers to tell her more. He then gets a message and has to head out, so Annie collects her payment and leaves. He and Muncie are contracted for a hit on a trafficker. John tells him this could be his last job for a very long time, leaving Muncie concerned. The two ready their weapons, and John enters through the front while Muncie heads around back. Inside, John can hear the showers running but soon has an episode where he dissociates. He gathers himself and heads to the shower, where he kills his target and a woman with him. He turns off the shower, but then another episode hits him. He is frightened by a figure and shoots, but is shocked to see Muncie on the receiving end. John apologizes to his friend, who dies soon after. He then stages the scene and leaves. He gets a call from Jericho about the incident but lies that he heard shots being fired. Detective Ikari and Raul arrive on the scene, and Ikari instantly feels that something is off. She notes that the shower was on when the curtain fell, so if everyone killed each other as the scene suggests, who turned off the shower? John goes to visit an old friend and fencer. He explains that he wants to cash out and get out of the business without Jericho knowing. He knows he botched the last hit, and the staged scene will only buy him a little time. He gives his friend a list of all the people he wants his money shared equally amongst once all his assets have been cashed out. John gets his paintings from a storage locker and brings them to his home when there is a knock at the door. He grabs his gun and heads to the door but is shocked to see an injured man there with a bleeding hand. When the man calls him Dad, he remembers that the man is Miles, his son. Inside, Miles is on the brink of breaking down as he has just killed someone. He tells John he has a granddaughter, Kaylee, who met this grown man online, and they have been seeing each other for a while, and Kaylee got pregnant. Miles went to his home to confront him but eventually lost it when the man began mocking his daughter and stabbed him to death in his kitchen. John wonders why Miles would come to him of all people, but Miles thinks John can help him since he thinks of John as a killer. John is a bit taken aback, but Miles begs him for help. John then takes the bloody knife and has Miles remove all his clothes and take a shower. Afterwards, Miles needs to head home and keep his mouth shut. John heads over to the dead man's address and breaks into the house to see the body still there. The scene is a mess with blood even on the ceiling, but he decides to get started, making a note to remind himself of what needs to be done. He finds a turkey baster and collects a sample of the dead man's blood and also his hair. John then ambushes and knocks out the security guard watching the tapes. He finds the footage of Miles arriving and deletes it. John returns to the home, sets the blood sample in the fridge, then saves the glass Miles drank from. Miles is at home, still freaking out over the entire incident. His wife comes to him and sees the injury on his hand, and Miles breaks down in tears, telling his wife everything. Detective Ikari is leading the investigation into the recent murders. She notes that Muncie is out of place as he is suspected to be a hitter for Jericho. She notes that John was suspiciously missing from the scene, but traffic cams caught both men driving together a few minutes earlier. John is particularly interesting as he has 2 PhDs and was a professor at one point and only served time for tax evasion when he was ratted out. His tenure in the U.S. military as a deep reconnaissance officer is of particular interest to them, and they plan to bring him in as a cooperating witness to learn more about him. The cops then get an alert of a second crime scene. This time the victim is a member of the Brotherhood. John goes to visit an old friend and mentor, Xavier Crane, showing him the list he made and wanting his help to formulate and stick to the plan to cover his tracks. Xavier notes that the plan is risky with John's failing mental state but promises to check in with John and keep him on point for as long as possible. Ikari and the other cops arrive at the bloody crime scene where there is no murder weapon, but a knife is missing from the kitchen block. Ikari knows the victim as Andrew Palmer, a simple pusher for the Brotherhood who has a history of being a PDF file. They go to speak with the security guard, but he has no idea who attacked him. Knox is at home when he hears the doorbell but cannot remember what the sound is. He hears a knock and opens the door to see Annie, totally forgetting that she was supposed to come over. As she talks to him, she can see that something is wrong. Annie goes to change and finds John's paintings under his bed and asks about their worth. John begins to dissociate rapidly as Annie tries to talk to him and suggests that she leave. As she leaves, she sees a book on neurology John had bookmarked and takes a picture with her cell. John is at home struggling to get a grip on his thoughts. He gets a call from Xavier reminding him about his list and telling him to remove the password from his cell phone before he forgets it. John thinks he is getting worse by the hour and is running out of time. John lifts Miles's fingerprints from the cup and plants them on the bloodied knife and also still has his bloodied clothes. He calls Xavier, asking him about a key he is holding, but Xavier cannot help him. John eventually tracks down the correct lockbox for his key and removes his stored cash. He then meets with a scared Miles in a diner, who explains that he brought Kaylee to the abortion clinic and is almost at his wit's end. He keeps insinuating that he isn't a killer like John, but John reminds him he actually is and needs to calm down. John explains that the cops will soon make the link between Kaylee and the dead gangster, then come to question him, but he must hold it together. Miles then reveals that he never hated John growing up and was a good dad in his own way. He always wanted to be like John until he found out what he actually did for a living and feared becoming like him, yet here they are. Ikari and the cops finally realize that Palmer's murder scene was staged and plan to bring in Knox for voluntary questioning. Meanwhile, John is parked outside Miles's home and watches as the family leaves for the day. He then finds the family's apartment and picks the locks to the home. There, he plants the bloodied knife inside a vent, leaving a screw loose to draw attention. He also plants Palmer's hair on Miles's coat and dumps the bloodied clothes inside the trash. Miles and the family are out for lunch when he sees a man glance at Kaylee. Unable to control himself, Miles confronts the man as he leaves and attacks him. Detective Rahl and another cop turn up at John's home, asking him to come with them for questioning, to which John agrees. Ikari does John's interview. She immediately confronts him with the details of the hurriedly staged scene and her theory about Muncie's death. John diverts, revealing that he knows Ikari's father and spoke to him a few days ago, but Ikari reveals her father has been dead for 12 years. The cops are confused, but John doesn't explain. He then tells the cops they have nothing to pin him to Muncie's death and leaves, telling them he has some things to put right. John returns to his car and goes to the next item on his list. He heads over to his ex-wife Ruby's house and hears no one, so he uses the hidden key to head inside. For a moment, he thinks he is back home and calls for Miles. He is looking inside the fridge when Ruby confronts him with a gun, shocked to see him. John explains that he is cashing out and will be leaving money for her and Miles. She wonders how long he is going away, but John knows there is no coming back from this one. Ruby is taken aback by this, thinking maybe his criminal life has caught up to him. As John leaves, Ruby tells him she still loves him and wants him to visit again, but John tells her there won't be a next time. By the following week, John's memory has worsened, and he is dissociating when Annie comes to visit him. He can hardly remember her, even calling her Ruby, but Annie doesn't complain, asking him about his cashing out. John tells her he has the cash and the paintings and only needs to retrieve his stones to be divided into thirds as she is supposed to get a cut, and Annie then reveals that she is not Ruby. Ikari's people are able to break into Palmer's cell phone and find records of his PDF file activities. They also find out that he had been meeting up with a girl on a regular basis, who turns out to be Kaylee. John then heads over to an old cabin he used to own and breaks inside. He then retrieves his stones from under the floorboard before leaving. He is walking back to his car but has an episode and finds himself unaware of where he is. He gets lost in the woods and ends up spending the entire day there. Meanwhile, Miles and his family are brought in for questioning. Ikari interviews Miles alone, showing him footage of him leaving Palmer's residence. Miles denies knowing anything but soon learns that the cops are currently searching his home and have found all the items that John hid in his house. Miles is shocked, hearing all the evidence they found on him and that he is under arrest for the murder of Palmer. After a few hours, John is found disoriented in the woods by a man and brought into town. Xavier turns up, and John doesn't even remember calling him. Xavier drives John back home. He confesses that he can only remember 3 hours ago and thinks his time has come. He wonders why Xavier chose to take him in after the army many years ago, and Xavier notes that he has a brilliant mind. Xavier reminds him of the last 2 steps he has to take, and then it will be all over. John is scared of what is to come, and Xavier understands. John asks Xavier to help him finish cashing out and heads inside his home to grab the cash. There he realizes that something is off and his gun is missing from its hiding spot. John is then confronted by 3 men led by Annie who have come to rob him. They demand John hand over his stone, but John distracts and attacks the men, killing one with a book and casually shooting the other 2. He finds Annie whimpering in a corner and aims his gun at her. He then reveals that she was one of the 3 to get a cut, but she went ahead and got greedy. He aims his gun, and the screen goes blank. We then see Xavier and the fencer dividing John's cash into 2. John goes to visit Miles in prison, who is confused about why John would betray him. John reveals he knows that Miles snitched him out for tax evasion many years ago and caused him to spend 6 years in prison. Miles denies this, but John just leaves. Ikari soon learns from the forensics team that the evidence linking Miles to Palmer's death was all planted, as they found that the blood was frozen and the fingerprints contained traces of packing tape material. As for the video footage of Miles, they also find out that the video was spliced and the timestamps manipulated, leaving Ikari disappointed. John burns his notebook. He then gets a call from Xavier reminding him of the last step for Xavier to make a phone call. Ikari is alerted to a phone call from an anonymous person, who turns out to be Xavier. He tells them that John Knox has 3 dead bodies in his home. When the cops burst in, John is sitting calmly, waiting for them to arrest him. Inside the house, they see evidence John purposely left behind, revealing he framed Miles. Ikari meets with Miles and decides to drop all charges. She asks about the cut he received, but recalling John's words, he tells her he cut his hand on a glass at John's house, which they also found. Ikari wonders why John would want to frame his own son for murder and then give himself up so easily. Miles recalls John's accusation and confesses that he was the one who turned John in, whether true or not. With all the blame now fully on Knox, he is locked away in prison. Ikari goes to visit him, asking him about Muncie's death, but John is now fully gone mentally and cannot remember anything. Miles arrives to see him and runs into Ikari. She wonders why he is visiting, and Miles tells her John killed his daughter's attacker, and he would do it all over again. Miles talks to John, who does not recognize him at all but recalls having a son that loves football. Miles breaks down in tears, telling John he loves him before leaving. Ruby and Miles receive their share of the cut. Annie has survived and receives John's library of books. John is moved to a medical facility, and the last shot of John is him staring catatonically through a window.